Good morning, everybody. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute. It's a great delight to see many friends here today. This is our fourth annual event on North American energy here at the Wilson Center. It's been a great pleasure to work with our colleagues at the Canada Institute, of course. We're very grateful to them for their collaboration. When we started this process a few years ago, what we decided to do was we wanted to focus on each year on the issues of the day. And if I look back at the program from 2014, the focus then was on prices, because that was the big issue, was that prices were beginning to slip and we didn't know how far they were going to go down. But it was also the industry's reactions to those prices, and of course in the Mexican context, how those declining prices were going to impact upon the prospects for reform and the success of the energy reforms in Mexico. In 2015, we were looking at the implementation of the reforms, the first rounds of auctions for oil contracts in Mexico. We were also looking at innovation as a response to the lower prices that we talked about the year before. And we were focusing and celebrating North American cooperation on energy issues, with the inauguration, of course, in December of 2014, of the North American Energy Ministers' meetings on a regular basis, and all of the very positive collaboration that came out of that. Last year, we celebrated the success of the Mexican energy reform, both on the hydrocarbons and electricity and renewable sides, and also the extraordinary level of integration between the three North American countries that we had witnessed. This year, we have a lot of issues to cover, of course, because if there's one thing that you can guarantee about politics, public policy, in particular in the energy sector, is that you're never going to be bored. There's always something, and of course that is as much a blessing as a curse, but there's an extraordinary array of issues. This year, obviously, the impact of the new administration here in the United States, the uncertainty over North American collaboration, cooperation, and in particular the NAFTA, and whether the energy chapter of NAFTA will be revised to include Mexico, etc. I remember last week I was asked by a journalist about Mexico's intention to join into Article 605 to look at the free import-export of refined products, which of course is hugely important for the retail sector now in Mexico. But also classic issues of regulation, infrastructure. And what I'm particularly excited about, not to take anything away from this morning's panels, but I'm particularly excited about our focus on innovation this afternoon. I always wanted these forums to be forward-looking, and I think we've got a terrific array of speakers throughout the day, and a lot of us are actually thinking about what is coming up in the future, not just what we have today. In addition to thanking my colleagues at the Canada Institute, in particular Laura Dawson, director of the Canada Institute, great colleague, I'd like to thank Carl Colby, who is the senior advisor for this event, Andrea Tanco, who has just done an extraordinary job of putting everything together here. Great thanks to Chevron, who is the sponsor of this event. It's been a real pleasure to work with our friends at Chevron, in particular with Alexandra Valderrama. And of course, Chevron is a globally active company, and obviously have an enormous amount to worry about in places like Venezuela today. So we much appreciate the focus that they've managed to maintain on Mexico and North America. A huge thanks to our panelists and moderators, some of whom have come from very far away. I'm deeply grateful to them. A special shout out to Luis Martinez Montoya from ASEA. Thank you so much for coming. We would like to obviously say, to express our sympathies and condolences for Mexico, the Mexican people. We've had a few cancellations from Mexicans who cannot come. Obviously, we understand that. It's a very, very difficult time in Mexico at the moment, and our feelings and our thoughts are with you all. The importance of these events, I think, remains the same, which is obviously the element of dialogue, that we're trying to get an active conversation going, but it's the focus of that dialogue which matters to me. A focus on North America, not just on US-Mexico or US-Canada, but really on a regional approach to understanding energy markets and the challenges that are coming up. We are aware of the situation right now, but of course next year is going to be a presidential and congressional election year in Mexico, and many people are predicting change there and a change of focus. We have to wait and see. I mean, nothing is written in stone yet. But any change that occurs in Mexico, as would occur in Canada or in the United States, will have an impact upon North American relations. And of course, we have to keep an eye out for any of the major disruptions that we could see happening, either on the side of prices or on technology. And that's, again, one of the things that I am looking forward to in our conversations today. One last word before I introduce Ambassador Jerónimo Gutiérrez to officially open this conference. I'd like to point out the importance of the energy trade between the United States and Mexico. This is one of the single most important elements in the bilateral trading relationship between the two countries, and of course it is a favorable balance for the United States, reversing the situation that has been taken as being the norm for decades and decades of Mexico exporting high-price crude oil to the United States. All of a sudden, Mexico is exporting less low-price crude oil to the United States and importing growing amounts of refined products and, of course, natural gas into their markets as the reforms take place and as demand for those products increases. This is one of the things that, to be honest with you, 4 years ago when we began this process, we would not have predicted. And I think it highlights once again how this is an ever-changing sector. So thank you very much for being here today. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce the Mexican ambassador to the United States, Jerónimo Gutiérrez. Ambassador, please, the microphone is yours.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's really a pleasure to be here with you this morning, to be with great friends of Mexico, and I always find it interesting to be here at the Mexico Center and at the Woodrow Wilson. I like to thank, in fact, the Mexico Center and also the Canada Institute and Mexico Institute and the sponsors for making this event possible. Thank you, Duncan. Thank you, Lara, for inviting me and for putting together in this fourth already occasion this outstanding event. And obviously the timing it couldn't be better. Let me also express on behalf of the Mexican government my thanks, my really very sincere thanks to the support that we have been getting as a result of the earthquake, both from the U.S. government and actually from a lot of people throughout the United States. As you know, Mexico has been struck bad by an earthquake recently. Mother Nature has also been difficult with several other parts of the United States, including most recently Puerto Rico. Our solidarity goes to all of them also. But in fact, Mexico has received a very warm support from the United States, and that is deeply appreciated. As you know, the evolution of the energy sector during the tenure of President Peña's Nieto administration has been ambitious, has been really game-changing, and I do believe that, as it has been said here before, it is completely transforming the Mexican energy sector and the Mexican economy. Mexico's new energy model involves the creation and the strengthening of the regulatory agencies, the enactment of more than 20 different pieces of legislation, 20 different laws, and the transformation of our state productive companies, both Pemex and CFE. More importantly, promoting the best international practices based on transparency and accountability to provide certainty and to develop trust among domestic and foreign investors for our industry to thrive has really been the norm. When the reform took place, earlier this morning we were talking about, but when the constitutional reform took place, there was a huge change in the price of oil. And despite the volatility in the international energy market since 2014, Mexico's energy reform, we believe, has indeed produced very good results. And let me just highlight some of them. In the oil and gas industry, we have done 7 exploration and production bids, in which 74% of the blocks have been successfully placed, 74%. Pemex successfully completed its first farm-out open to competition. As a result of these processes, 33 national and 33 international firms have committed nearly $60 billion to new upstream investments in Mexico. In the electricity sector, progress has certainly also been achieved. We created a wholesale electricity market in which the national electricity company and private companies participate under very transparent rules and under equal circumstances. An independent system operator, the SENACE, controls and optimizes the dispatch of power plants and manages the open access to transmission and distribution infrastructure. And also, and finally, to promote clean energies, we performed 2 long-term power auctions and awarded 32 winning companies contracts for the acquisition of energy, power, and clean energy certificates. Altogether, these companies will provide an approximate investment, it is estimated, of $6.6 billion to incorporate about 5 new gigawatts of a sustainable power generation. This transformation is strengthening the energy integration with our North American neighbors. As you know, Secretary Rick Perry and Minister Jim Carr of Canada and Secretary Pedro Joaquin Caldwell recently met in Mexico City to share their perspective and to intensify collaboration on a strong bilateral agenda that increases our trade in energy, investment, infrastructure, and energy security, which is important. And obviously, to keep this good work going on, we always need, and we need to continue to think as an integrated region, and that's precisely what we're trying to do in different realms, including obviously the energy sector. In closing, let me say that we're certain that the energy reform, it's clearly improving our energy industry in Mexico, and it's also providing very important business opportunity for partners worldwide. And it's also benefiting the economy of Mexico, but certainly the regional economies and the supply chains between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. All of you have a very deep knowledge of the energy sector and understand its complexities. So I'm confident that your discussions will be very fruitful throughout today and will result in a broad consensus about a prosperous future for North America. Let me thank you again, congratulate the institutes, both institutes in putting this 4th edition of the Energy Forum. It is a privilege to participate as ambassador and for the Mexican government to be here. And I wish you all the success. And my understanding, according to what Duncan said, is that I might take some questions, but only on cultural cooperation, please. Just go ahead.
Any questions from the audience?
I actually have one.
Please.
Andrea Tanco, program assistant here. So you're now serve as ambassador, but before as director of the North American Development Bank. You have a broad perspective of the North America outlook. So I was wondering if you could provide some insight as how do you see energy playing into integrating North America, especially with the challenge that we have in Mexico with a new president that might come up next year that might not be as friendly with the current energy reform?
Okay, that's a good question. It's a 2-part question, but that's a good part question. The first, about 6 months ago, I actually asked Hector here. There's a lot of talk about energy security in North America. And quite honestly, I wasn't 100% sure what it meant. So I said, Hector, when people talk about energy security in North America, what exactly are we talking about? And sure enough, he came with a very good and clear answer. He said, it implies access at competitive prices on a sustainable basis throughout time of to energy, different energy sources for North America. That's good enough. Since then, what I've learned, and I may be wrong, is 2 things. That concept of energy security is for the first time achievable, truly achievable within North America. If if we basically continue to do what we're doing together, the three countries. And that's quite significant. In a complex world, having that energy security is very important. My experience at the border is that 2 or 3 things are relevant in order to continue, in order to achieve that energy security. One, in which we're already working very heavily, is natural gas. No? Mexico needs the natural gas. The U.S. has a supply for natural gas. There are, to my knowledge, 6 or 7 different pipelines that are being built on their different stages. And that will provide enormous benefits to the United States and to Mexico. I think that's clear to the relevant players on both sides, and it's moving along. No? I would like, my own view is that the North American Development Bank should get involved in natural gas, since it has an environmental mandate. There are people that question whether that's the right approach. I think it does make a lot of sense to have the bank involved in natural gas, because natural gas it is a fossil fuel, but it's, to my knowledge, 50% cleaner than other fossil fuels that are still being used in Mexico. So it would make a sense, at least from a transitional point of view. And secondly, it provides a very good complement to what we're doing at the border jointly, which is the border has very good, and that's the other part of the answer, has a very good opportunity for renewables. And it's actually, a lot of things are being done on renewables at the border region, both on the US and Mexico. And I'm not talking about panels in any wall, by the way. And the third thing, so that I think would be a wise policy decision. It's part of the discussions that are taking place. And the third thing, and I'm not an expert, we have been trading on electricity for a long time, but largely, to my knowledge, as a result of emergencies on either one of the sides. And it is my understanding also that there would be significant benefits if we can continue to do more trade on electricity, and that we can do more transmission lines throughout the border. That's what I've heard. And I think those are the opportunities. Now, the second part of your question, and I was just in a breakfast and I was asked a very similar question. I don't know exactly who you're talking about, but on the election, I think, quite frankly, it's too early to call. I think that any one of the parties and candidates can win. My own view is that they're pretty much nose to nose with one another. Probably the 3 big ones at around a third, and there's still a long time to do. I think the policies of each on energy sector are very clear at this point. Mr. López Obrador came here to this forum and expressed that he wanted to review or revisit the contracts. I think that it would be important to understand exactly what does that mean with a little bit more precision. He has also openly and clearly expressed previous to that some concerns about the constitutional reform. My understanding is that he has also talked about a referendum in the should he win in the midterm of the administration. And this is public information, so I'm not, please don't quote me, it's out there, quote somebody else. I think, in my own view, this reform is crucial, and it should be kept. I think that one of the benefits of the reform in the way Mexico has conducted that reform is precisely the fact that we did it so late in time, 70 years, that we actually were able to learn from the different models that have taken place in a long time, how they do this everywhere in the world. And the reform ended up coming with a very Mexican model, in which the state and the private sector, in my view, it has struck a right balance between keeping between the state and the business sector to truly develop the energy sector. So I think that's very important. Even if that does not take place, the implementation of the reform, one thing is the constitutional reform. There's a clear established process in which the Constitution can be reformed. I take it that any one of the potential candidates will adhere to those processes. And it's not easy to change the Constitution precisely because that's the way our founding fathers thought of it. If you want to change something as important, it'll take a lot of time. Having said that and understanding that that's not an easy process, the execution of any reform, it's also crucial. And it will depend a lot. The continuing implementation of the reform will also be very much contingent on what is the impetus that the chief executive puts on the implementation of the reform. There are people here in Mexico that believe that this is an important reform and are willing to defend it, and I certainly find myself on that side of the aisle. No?
Thank you, Ambassador, for your comments. My name is Guillermo Garcia. I'm an associate professor of law at Texas A&M School of Law, and I want to piggyback a little bit on that question. Because what would be your message to the foreign investors that are right now in Mexico participating in the bidding processes that are a little bit scared both not only of whatever happens with the election, but what's going to happen with Chapter 11 of NAFTA? Because at least they feel that regardless of whether there is a constitutional reform or whatever happens in Mexico, at least right now they have some sort of protections and some type of arbitral forum to attend according to Chapter 11 of the current NAFTA. And we don't know if that's going to stay, and the current Trump administration has stated that at least from the U.S. perspective, they want to put an opt-in clause, whether any state wants to participate in a way to force in Mexico, but keeping the United States and Canada out of that clause. You have any comments about that?
Yes. I find that now there are three different groups of people approaching Chapter 11 from different places, and it's somewhat strange what is going on. Chapter 11 was introduced in the North American Free Trade Agreement 25 years ago, largely as a result of U.S. concerns regarding the certainty in investment. And Article 2 of the treaty, actually, or 3, I can remember, it states that one of the objectives is actually promote cross-border investment or thereabouts. So at that time, that was seen crucial. And yes, things do evolve. And now there are three different groups. One group thinks that Chapter 11 has, there's our group. And our group believes that it's important to have, that it can certainly be reviewed and improved, but it's important. It does give certainty. The truth is that that clause was a recognition that our legal system was far less advanced than the US and Canadian legal system at the time that that agreement was signed. Our legal system has improved significantly over the last 25 years. To the point that they're equal, I don't know. That's up to the investor to decide. It has certainly improved a lot, but nevertheless, it does represent an important selling point for foreign investment in Mexico. I don't see why something like that would not be an interest to the United States to continue to keep. So that's our group. The second group is people here, mainly in the United States, that my understanding is that they see this through the lens of a sovereignty issue, and that you're not, there are actually four groups. So that's another one. There's another group that sees this and says, this is a wrong incentive because that is incentivizing U.S. investment that it's going to Mexico rather than U.S. mostly, I don't know, to Canada, or you can talk about that or not. But it's going actually, and it's sort of an unfair incentive because it's above. In any case, Chapter 11 was meant to equalize the certainty for investments. The only thing it does, in my view, is equalize that certainty. It does not put Mexico above the United States in any way. So I don't think. And finally, there's a group that thinks that Chapter 11 is it's a way in which bad multinational big companies just abuse and pressure governments throughout Mexico and the Americas. And there are some cases of that, but I don't think they have to do with Chapter 11. I think that if everybody's reasonable with respect what Chapter 11 implies, there could be room for improvement, but maintaining that. That's my own view. As we speak, they're discussing this in Ottawa, and among other things. But I think that if we keep our heads cool, if that's not the case, Mexico can very well pass a investment protection law that will basically do the same thing. And that can happen also, and there's a possibility. Mexico is interested in keeping our foreign investments that are already there and increasing that investments. So we can certainly take also that track, and we're ready to do it, should it be necessary. And I don't think that, I've heard also with respect to the energy sector, two sides. One is that, in fact, the constitutional reform, given the way it was structured, and you're the law professor, not me, it does provide the required certainty, and that it's not really necessary to include too much more into the free trade agreement. I think that's part of the discussions that we have had recently. So Mexico understands the importance of giving that certainty to the investment in the present context. That is our take on what is going on with respect to NAFTA in the energy sector, and we will do as much as we can to make sure that that foreign investment is secure. That's the general idea.
We're going to go straight into our first panel now, and I'd like to welcome our dear friend John Padilla from IPD, one of the best known and quoted experts on Mexico, Colombia, and places far beyond that as well. John, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everybody. It's fantastic to be here and to be on terra firme as I was in Mexico City on Tuesday. And let me just start out with hopefully some provocative comments. We're going to do something a little bit different here this morning and have more of kind of a fireside chat. So this is going to hopefully be very interactive. But energy integration, I would not be here had it not been for the Mexico energy reform. So the 17 years that we basically worked to help lobby directly and indirectly what was taking place is exactly why we're all sitting here this morning. And I think that's a really important concept to kind of put into perspective. The other second kind of provocative comment that I would make, just to kind of get things started here, is that I would actually purport that the U.S. Energy revolution would certainly not have gained the pace that it has gained without the opening of the Mexican energy sector. So that's just some little thoughts to kind of, better than coffee. And let me introduce myself. I'm John Padilla. I'm a managing director of IPD Latin America. We're an energy consultancy that covers the region. I'm based in Bogota, Colombia, and we have offices in Caracas, Venezuela, as well as Mexico City. Prior to that, I actually spent 10 years on Wall Street. I did project finance, so that's my background. I'm joined here by two fantastic gentlemen that we're delighted to have. Dave Lai, who is the Vice President for External Affairs with Encana, and Rob Dutton, who is the President of Devon, Canada, who is also the President of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. And that's important. If you've not taken a look at the document, there was a joint document that was signed by CAP, as well as API and Amexi. And unfortunately, given the circumstances in Mexico, Alberto de la Fuente, who's the president of Amexi, wasn't able to join us. So I'm going to wear a couple of hats here this morning, besides kind of being the token gringo Mexican on our panel. I'll also kind of tip my hat in terms of midstream and downstream, because energy integration actually really starts there, much more so than on the upstream side. With that, if I'm just going to I always find it much friendlier and healthier if everybody kind of introduces themselves and kind of gives a little bit of background. So Dave, please.
Sure, thanks, John, and thanks, Laura and Duncan and Carl for inviting us and giving us the opportunity to share some thoughts with you this morning. As John said, my name is Dave Lai. I lead external affairs for Encana Corporation. Those of you that don't know Encana, we're a Canadian, Calgary, Alberta-based oil and gas company. We're active in both Canada and the U.S. About 50% of our business is on either side of the border. We are an unconventional producer, so I think when most people think of oil and gas in Canada, they think of oil sands, but there's certainly a large oil and gas business that's outside the oil sands, and that's where we work. We are what we call an unconventional producer. So that basically means that we focus on developing liquid-rich natural gas and light tight oil out of shale formations. In Canada, our business is primarily liquid-rich natural gas and condensate. The condensate goes up to support the oil sands operations, so certainly integration there as well. And then in the U.S., we're active in Texas, and we develop light tight oil in the Permian and the Eagle Ford plays, if you follow plays. We also have some holdings in New Mexico, and we have a U.S. head office in Denver. We employ about 3,000 people, roughly evenly split on each side of the border, and we produce about 320,000 barrels a day of oil currently.
Yes, good morning, and again, thanks to our host for the invitation. Quite happy to be here. A little warmer than I was expecting. It's always a struggle for some of us Canadians to acclimatize in the snap of a finger, but great to be here nonetheless. One small correction. I'm the board chair for CAP. Tim McMillan is the president of CAP back in Canada. CAP is an association that represents the Canadian upstream oil and natural gas industry. Our producer members produce about 80% of Canada's natural gas and crude oil. And CAP is an advocate for and enables economic competitiveness and safe and environmental and socially responsible performance. That's the one hat I'm wearing today, and the other one is as president of Devon Canada. A little bit about Devon Energy. Devon is an onshore North American oil and gas producer. We're headquartered in Oklahoma City. We have a fairly large presence in Canada as well, which I'm responsible to. Our focus on growth is also in the tight oil shale plays in the U.S. We do have a large oil sands operation in Canada as well. But our positions where we see some of the growth opportunities are in Permian Stack and the Eagle Ford, much like Dave has described.
Okay, fantastic. So I thought that we would actually kind of start out with just some facts, because the reality of the matter is that when we talked about energy integration and we talk about North America in the energy sector, people, rightfully so, have always kind of said North America is U.S. Canada. So the concept that Mexico is now kind of in the mix, I think, is something that is a game changer for the industry. And what I wanted actually to start out with was some facts, because I think facts are always very helpful. So we're at a stage right now where it's the last day of the third of supposedly 7 rounds of negotiations in Ottawa, and I think it's important to kind of put in context, NAFTA. So an agreement that was put in place back in '93 in a very different kind of environment in terms of what the objectives were. And so the objectives were clearly to kind of bring Mexico into the fold and create a much stronger North America. In general terms, I think that's something that hopefully everybody can kind of agree on. And the trading bloc of North America is second to none. So we're talking about GDP that is collectively combined is 28.8% of the global GDP. So you talk about the European Union, you exclude the UK, you're 17.5%, China's 15%. There's not any other trading bloc in the world that even comes remotely close. So why do I mention that? I think it's important to kind of put that in context because energy becomes a very, very critical component of that. So where are we at in terms of actual trade? Trade is now in excess of $1.1 trillion. All right, eyes glazed, people can't comprehend what $1.1 trillion is. It's $3 billion a day. All right, $3 billion a day is the amount of trade that's going from on both sides of the border. What that means in very practical terms is that you need tremendous amount of transport and logistics for starters. You then need tremendous amount of technology to support that. And oh, by the way, you need energy. So energy is a vital component to the robustness of that kind of activity. And that creates all economic activity overall. So has activity been successful out of NAFTA? Well, on the Mexican side, I think the evidence is unbelievably clear, and trade has increased almost fivefold, up to now almost $500 billion, which is closing in on the amount of trade that takes place between the U.S. and Canada. So, in terms of going back to the original premises of what NAFTA was supposed to do, I think that that objective is definitely coming to fruition. The details of whether you have what's being discussed right now in Ottawa in terms of labor, et cetera, I think those are other details that get to the point of that the agreement needs to be modernized, it needs to be tweaked, et cetera. But Mexico is now importing 80% of all of its natural gas. And that just doesn't impact the U.S. It also frees up capacity that Canada then allows it to bring gas down into the United States. So it becomes much more of a fluid system that is important. 62% of its gasoline is now imported from abroad in Mexico, 56% of its diesel. So these are huge numbers that we're talking about. We're talking 5 BCF per day of natural gas is being imported into Mexico. Radically different dynamic than what we had just even a decade ago. So in terms of trade, and what Duncan was talking about at the onset, you've had a complete flip of the switch where Mexico was exporting amazing amounts of crude to the United States, and even natural gas, and now you have a flip of the switch, and we went from about $21 billion trade balance, a trade deficit to Mexico from the U.S. to a $10 billion trade balance. So when the Trump administration is taking a look at trade deficits, et cetera, energy is actually one of the bright spots here. And I think that's a really important component to kind of keep in mind. Two last little things that I'm going to kind of put out there before we kind of jump into some discussion. And this really relates to kind of midstream and downstream. So as the ambassador talked about, electricity, cross-border trade is really a very vital component. So DC tie lines are ones that should hopefully continue to grow. You have the Sharyland Utilities DC tie line across the border. They just had an open season here at the end of August, very successful. $8.5 billion of investment has come into Mexico from U.S. and Canadian sources, committed capital by our estimates since 2014. And interestingly enough, half of that has actually been from the midstream sector side. And when you take a look at the companies that are involved, it's U.S. and Canadian companies, TransCanada and Eonova, that have had some of the biggest investments that are there. There's a slew of other companies as well. And then on the E&P side, we've had 70 E&P contracts that have been awarded, from shallow water to onshore to to deep water, which is including Trion and the other deep water blocks that were awarded. So there's been a lot of activity. What I thought we would do, so I'm wearing my kind of Mexico cap here, but what I thought I would do is really kind of start out with a discussion here with Dave and Rob to get an understanding of kind of how they perceive what has NAFTA meant to their companies, specifically to the region as a whole, and to Canada, or from that perspective. And it's really just kind of an open-ended discussion that hopefully we'll get into here. So I'm not sure, Rob, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Thank you. You know, from our company's perspective, and I guess from the perspective of most producers who have operations in both countries, we don't necessarily see the border as being something that exists in terms of a trade barrier. And it's important for us to understand that infrastructure exists, and that the energy that we produce can travel freely across that border. Quite truthfully, over the past couple of decades that NAFTA has been part of our landscape, it's really become an integral part of what we see as our business. And without it, we'd have a different view of things, I think, for sure. We believe that, you know, we've seen evidence that the NAFTA agreement specifically related to energy has kept energy affordable and reliable. You know, there's a safety and security of supply, and has been mutually beneficial for the parties involved. So from where we sit, we think that NAFTA has been successful in its intent, and we see it as an integral part of what, and I say integral part, we don't even think about it because it's just part of the landscape. And for it to change dramatically at this stage would be something we'd have to take a long, hard look at. Yeah, thanks.
Dave?
All I would add, I agree completely. And, you know, from our perspective, and I think for most, if not all, in our industry, the view is NAFTA works. And as the North American energy picture has changed over the last decade or so with the advent of the shale resource, both gas and oil, you know, it used to be 10, 15 years ago that the challenge was supply and resource. That's no longer an issue. The challenge for us now is markets and market access. And I think what NAFTA does do in a North American context for sure, and as things continue to evolve, hopefully in an international context, is provide market access, which is critical for us to grow and continue. And I think it gives North America a tremendous opportunity to be a supplier of energy on the world stage, a supplier of responsibly developed, clean, well-regulated energy that the world needs. So, you know, we're certainly supportive of NAFTA. We, as Rob said, you know, there's likely a couple tweaks that could be made if people are so inclined. But you know, our primary message to the negotiating teams in every country is do no harm through the from an energy perspective as negotiations progress.
Oh, perfect. And I think that's an overriding theme across the board that we're seeing is the do no harm. You know, modernize, tweak, but do no harm. I think there's an interest to, you know, talk a little bit about specifics within NAFTA, but what I would say is that as soon as you talk beyond the surface of many of these topics, they immediately become incredibly technical very, very quickly. And without kind of boring everybody to tears, I think it would be better to really kind of focus on some of the more takeaways of what works and what doesn't work, right? So, I mean, again, if you've not seen the joint paper that was put out by the three associations, I'd encourage you to do so. And I mean, I think it's important to put in context that those three associations represent 750 companies in the region. That's an incredibly powerful voice, and the fact that they were able to kind of come together and collectively put out a single document, you know, is many times like herding cats, right? I mean, it's
Well, that was my observation too. As a signatory to that letter, the fact that those three groups could come together and quite quickly and agree that there was there was mutual benefit in what we had seen, I think speaks volumes as to what opportunity we have in front of us right now.
No, and so there's clearly a lot of conjecture out there in terms of what's being included, what's not being included, what are the proposals that the U.S. is putting on the table, which has certainly created quite a bit of clamor. And I think what's been interesting to see is just how effective thus far industry has been in terms of saying, hey, wait a minute, this is the numbers that I put out are significant, and this will affect a lot of people. So I think the do no harm is clearly one of the main topics. There's also either reduced tariffs or the elimination of them, and this is a topic that I think would be really interesting to kind of get into, just from the day-to-day practical perspective in terms of what that means to you gentlemen on a day-to-day basis. There's investor protection mechanisms, which has certainly gotten people quite concerned, and as it relates to Mexico, so putting on my Mexico hat on again, I would say that there's a lot of people that invested into all of this activity based on the fact that they had protection through NAFTA. As the ambassador said, perhaps Mexico, if there's some type of rollback, will try to integrate some of those provisions into their into the legislation, et cetera, but that's another story. The other topic that I think will be interesting to get into here is rules of origin. Diluent, which I think is much more of a topic at this stage between the U.S. and Canada. It's theoretical right now as it relates to Mexico. And then regulatory cooperation, so which really kind of gets to dollars and cents at the end of the day, in the sense that if you've got consistent regulatory activity across borders, then you're not at a disadvantage or an advantage one way or the other. So without kind of getting into the weeds and putting people to sleep, I think what would be more fun to do is really talk about some of the more kind of day-to-day practical experiences that you gentlemen deal with. And I think one of them starts really with tariffs. And Dave, I'd be interested kind of in your perspective. We talked a little bit about how right now the way that the rules work, you have almost like a bill of lading that applies. So if you could share with us maybe a little bit of just the practical experience and you know how that's working, what's not working.
Sure, and again, just to reiterate, these are not substantive issues that we're recommending, you know, that are number one on the negotiators list, but they are irritants, and if the goal is to improve the effectiveness of energy trade in the region, some of these things could be worked on and tweaked, and the issue you're referring to is it's not so much a tariff issue, it's related to rules of origin, and it's really certificate of origin, and it's demonstrating that gas, oil and gas that's produced in the North American region is in fact North American, and therefore is entitled to tariff-free transport across borders. The challenge is that the rules as currently constructed, we're envisioning a hard good or physical transport of trade, and the reality is today in the commodities trade, it's electronic. It's the molecule of gas that I produce and John purchases aren't the same. It's electronic trade. We produce a molecule, we put it onto the system. John purchases a molecule, pulls it off the system in somewhere south, and everybody is held whole. The challenge is the way the custom rules are built to prove North American origin. We have to show a paper trail back from where that molecule was imported to where it was produced. And that's for all intents and purposes, impossible to do from an oil and gas perspective. So what we're proposing or suggesting is that and again, it's more of a customs rule issue than it is a trade rule, but the customs rules or the certificate of origin rules are modernized to reflect the fact that it's an electronic market. I think there's ways of doing that. There was language in the TPP that addressed this, and basically the simple answer is if oil and gas is said to have originated from Canada, it's deemed to have originated from Canada unless declared otherwise. And the simple rule from that, or reason behind that, is there's no real practical or in the case of natural gas, possible way of getting foreign offshore non-NAFTA natural gas, and for the most part, I guess theoretically it's possible to bring oil cargoes in. I'm not sure why anybody would do that. I don't think the upside of tariff-free transport would be enough to offset the transportation costs. But that aside, there is really no backdoor to non-North American, non-NAFTA gas coming in. So again, it's an irritant. It's probably in the value for a cost to industry around what, $20 to $30 million a year.
I think that's the number we're currently working with.
You know, so in the scheme of the numbers that John was talking about, overall trade or even energy trade, it's minor, but it's one of the opportunities we see for improvement.
So Rob, I mean, it showed right there my ignorance on some of the technical issues, and that's exactly where we're not getting into the weeds. So let's talk about actually labor and kind of free movement. And I think probably at CAP you have some views on that, Rob. If you could share some of those with us.
Yeah, certainly, and we it's. Over the past number of years, labor has been an issue in the recent past, or I guess a couple of years ago, in the lack of labor. And what's interesting now is we've seen a slowdown. We still have a labor issue in the sense that when I talk to my friends over at the services groups, they're having difficulty in securing enough qualified labor again, given that a large number of the labor force has moved on during the downturn, and they're in some respects not willing to come back. And so we see labor as a continuing issue for our industry for sure. And if there were opportunities within this framework to allow labor movement across the border, I think it would be beneficial to all the parties involved as we go forward, because I really do think, and it is a bit I guess not what we would think. It's the reverse of what we would think. We think there'd be a lot of people waiting to go and to be able to come back into the workforce, but they've either moved on or they've aged out, and we need to help backstop that. And anything we can do in that regard would certainly be welcome.
Well, I think just in general terms, you have a aging workforce across the board, and I mean it's why you've had kind of a proliferation of folks, for instance, from Venezuela that have come up into Canada, et cetera. And I mean, if you can cultivate that kind of activity within North America, I mean, it seems like a complete win-win.
Yeah, absolutely. And even we talk about labor too, but even the exchange of technology and ideas, and some of the science, the science-focused labor, if you will, to make sure that also has free and unfettered access across all our borders would be really helpful.
No, interesting. Okay, so we have to have the awkward moment, because it's not fun if you don't have an awkward moment. So the one awkward moment that we have in the in NAFTA is climate change. And so what I want to do is I want to actually kind of address it much more from an issue of competitiveness. And because I think that this is where symmetry is quite important. And Rob, maybe if you could kind of address some of that from the competitiveness factor and how that fits in and how you guys look at it at CAP.
Well, for sure. And, I'm actually quite happy to talk about this, as a matter of fact, because it is something that we talk about extensively, and it's an important element. I think it's important to note that it's the interest of all our stakeholders to have a sustainable and competitive energy industry. We believe our industry is uniquely positioned to play a large part in reducing our carbon footprint, and quite honestly, we have an obligation to do so. We have as much control over that as anybody. So in saying that, though, what I had mentioned before was, sustainable and competitive means that there has to be some method or understanding of equal footing. And where there is pressures placed on one part of the system, relief in other parts would be, I think, appropriate. So as we move forward with understanding our obligations and our commitments in this endeavor to reduce our carbon footprint as producers, we also have to make sure that we're remaining competitive across the landscape, both internally but externally with all of our competitors in North America and, quite frankly, around the world.
And Dave, you head up external affairs, and part of that is also environment and sustainability. So, maybe you can share just some of the, very kind of day-to-day practical issues that you kind of deal with, and how it is, what keeps you kind of scratching your head at night and up.
Well, I think it goes back to what Rob was mentioning, and it's all about competitiveness. Like we certainly support the direction that the Canadian government is taking around climate policy, and we respect that direction, and are well engaged in working to deliver on those commitments. But similarly, we recognize that the U.S. is taking a different path. And that's where the delta in competitiveness occurs. And the challenge for us is that the U.S., from a Canadian perspective, is both our biggest customer, but they're also our biggest competitor. So what that does is, if you're burdening production with a carbon tax or another instrument in one jurisdiction, and that burden doesn't exist in the other jurisdiction, you create that competitive issue. And that day to day, what that does is impact capital allocation, right? Because we view ourselves as very disciplined around capital allocation, and we spend a lot of time looking at margins, and costs is a big portion of that, so that is influencing investment decisions. And what we're advocating for is respecting each jurisdiction's responsibility and autonomy to make domestic policy, is when you're putting policy on trade exposed, energy intensive trade exposed things like energy, and it's not just an issue for energy. Cement, I think, has fertilizer have similar concerns. A mechanism to keep true the trade portion of that export. So through some sort of policy tool that keeps the commodity that's being exported into the jurisdiction that doesn't have that added cost benefit whole is what we're looking for and advocating for in a lot of the work we're currently doing with through CAP and consulting with the Canadian government.
Okay. Oh, fantastic. All right. So the vision, I think that's the way that we're going to at least wrap up with our kind of formal discussion here. And then, please, if there's questions, we can go into that. But I think, what does a fully integrated energy market look like to you? I mean, what's the vision that CAP has of that? What does it look like? What does it feel like? How is that going to impact people's day-to-day life? I mean, if you could share maybe some of your thoughts on that, Rob.
Well, I don't know that it looks entirely different than it does today, quite truthfully, maybe expanded to some degree. a more inclusive understanding between all three partners within NAFTA. You know, really, it's about preserving, you know, and enhancing to some degree, but preserving primarily the existing framework that we currently have. I don't know, you know, the concept around North American energy security, I think that the ambassador referred to. I think it's an important element, and I think NAFTA can play an important part in making sure we have secure, affordable, and North American self-supplied energy. And I think something, if you ask me what I think we would look to in the future, it's really something along those lines that NAFTA can play a real big role in.
Dave, you have some thoughts on that?
Sure, at the risk of, you know, what he said. But kind of building on that, you know, I think that there's a huge opportunity for North America to be self-sufficient. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think resource and supply is the issue. I think market access is the issue. And if you build on that, I know down on this side of the border there's lots of talk of energy dominance. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but I think what it could mean is North America as a significant producer of energy on the world stage. And as I said earlier, you know, that's responsibly developed, well-regulated energy that can displace energy from higher carbon with a higher carbon footprint in other jurisdictions. So I think that's really the vision and the opportunity that NAFTA provides, both a well-functioning integrated market within North America, but also facilitating and enabling that access to the world market.
Okay. I will put myself out there, and I will say that energy, that we've only scratched the surface, at least as it relates to Mexico, and once you have integrated markets, I say we get to 30% of GDP globally. So with that, I will turn it over to any questions that anybody has out there in the audience. Anybody? Laura?
Yeah, Laura Dawson, Canada Institute. Thank you for that. That was really great, especially the electronic transfer of molecules, Dave. I really like that. Looking not specifically at NAFTA, but the overall North American market, thinking about things that can make the conditions of cooperation and competitiveness better for all of us. I mean, sometimes difference means that we have opportunities. We have good innovation, or we got shale gas and you got oil sands, whatever they do. Sometimes that difference makes opportunities, but governments get involved and they create differences that just, you know, cost money and create problems. So if you could identify one or two main areas of difference or burden that are causing problems for your firm or operation particularly, where would you go? Is it the labor? Is it the regulatory? Is it rules of origin? What's one or two things that you would change right now that would help your industry?
Go ahead, Dave.
Thanks. Well, I think the first one we've touched on, and that's climate policy, and it's not a debate about should we have climate policy or should we not. It's the divergence of policy paths that I think keep us up at night. You know, and then from there, it's I think it's still regulatory certainty and either around investment or timelines around approval processes. It's really that being able to understand a clear process that has reasonably reliable timelines to allow you to make capital decisions.
And Laura, that's actually the number one thing for me too, would be the regulatory piece. When we make or try to make investment decisions that go out 20 or 30 years, as much certainty as is reasonably can be acquired is what is required to make that sort of investment. And with timelines to get started and consequently get finished that seem to be unmanaged and free range at times, it makes it difficult for companies like ours to put any plans together to make that happen. So it's the regulatory frameworks with some timeline that we can plan to.
Thanks. I'm really glad that you brought up the energy dominance phrase, because it's always struck me as being a little bit ridiculous. To me, it sounds like a hairy-chested version of energy independence. And let's face it, the point about energy integration in North America is more about having efficient markets. It's more about actually helping the rest of the economy to grow. It's more about creating prosperity than it is about being able to dominate other regions of the world. And that's the way that other parts of the world think, perhaps. You know, particularly that enormous country called Russia thinks about the way in which they can use energy to dominate other regions. That's not how we think in North America. What we're interested in is about having efficient markets that play a role in generating prosperity, and obviously being independent so that we don't have to depend upon unreliable sources of energy is the key. And I think that it's one of the elements that we still haven't put out there into the public realm clearly enough, is that these three countries, the United States, Mexico, and Canada, work together incredibly well. The United States is enormously blessed to have two neighbors. First of all, two neighbors, not 3, 5, whatever. Two neighbors, both of whom are friendly suppliers of energy. This is an extraordinary opportunity. And now we're seeing, thanks to the Mexican energy reform, that also Mexico is an enormous market for US and Canadian energy. And that's ideally where we want to get to. I know that's not a question, but I wanted to put that out there and see if you have any reaction.
Well, I guess my first reaction to that is market expansion, I think, is something we all seek. And an expanded market that looks as a larger playing field for companies such as ours and for the producers I represent, I think is an opportunity that we would be crazy to overlook. So I would share your thoughts on that for sure.
Hi, Guillermo Garcia again from Texas A&M. I wanted to know if you have any particular views on the proposal from Canada to include protection of indigenous communities in the renegotiation, because I know, at least from the energy perspective, energy companies tend to always get involved in somehow with lands that belong to indigenous communities. In Mexico, we have a big population of indigenous communities, and in the United States, after the North Dakota Access Pipeline, there was a huge debate also. So the three nations share this concern, and I know Canadians have had a lot of experience of negotiating and consulting with the community, so I wanted to know if you have, from the industry perspective, any views on that proposal.
Yeah, we do. I mean, our consultation and our partnership with our indigenous communities has been a very important element for us and continues to evolve. I know personally from my company, we have very strong relationships and valuable ones with our indigenous communities, and we really rely on them to help us in many different ways. And as we go forward, I think it's important to acknowledge that and to have some mechanism for us to work within, with them as we go forward. They are a very important partner that we have great respect and value for. So I'm not sure what that means for NAFTA necessarily, but I know from our own, from CAP and from Devon, it's a major opportunity for us, and we've seen some real wins over the years. Yeah, there's one at the back, too.
Hi, I'm Hillary Novick from Eurasia Group. Just back to really quickly to the regulatory harmonization that you were talking about. Do you think there's room for anything about cross-border pipelines in the renegotiation of NAFTA, or do you think it's too politically charged right now?
I don't know. I mean, there are, if you look at the pipeline system that currently exists, there are a number of pipelines that cross the U.S.-Canada border. So I think, I'm not sure there's anything to really talk about. It already exists, and I think the KXL debate has highlighted where things can maybe not go the way we have expected. But over the course of our history, there has been a number of pipelines that cross that border, and I think from at least my perspective, it's kind of old news. And in this case, it was made into new news for reasons that really weren't related to trade.
If I could just add, if you take a look at the U.S.-Mexico border and you take a look at all the activity in the Permian right now, every project is looking to move product basically over to Agua Dulce and then across the border or to access the western Mexican side. So there's a lot of business activity that's already taking place, and there's a lot of people that have very significant interests to make sure that that's going to continue to move forward.
Yeah, it's been a long part of our history already, and I would expect it to continue. Now, if NAFTA can do something to remove some barriers, that would be great.
That was going to be my answer. If you know, on sort of on the broader topic of regulatory cooperation, you know, respecting each jurisdiction's autonomy for setting regulations. But again, that idea of clarity and alignment of timelines and process, if there was opportunities to include that in a broader regulatory coherence cooperation section, that would be beneficial. But you know, pipeline language specifically, I'm not sure.
Thanks very much. Matthew Rooney from the George W. Bush Institute in Dallas, Texas. A comment and a question. On this, the comment is on the way that regulatory cooperation has been characterized here this morning. It sounds a little bit like calling into question the presidential permitting process in the United States, which we would certainly endorse calling that into question. We've suggested and encouraged the administration to consider reforming the presidential permit process so that it comes with a presumption of approval rather than an open-ended question to the president, is this piece of cross-border infrastructure in the national interest of the United States? Seems kind of curious that after 25 years of NAFTA, there should still be a question as to whether the infrastructure that it takes to move the goods we've agreed should flow freely across our borders would be in the national interest of the United States. So without eliminating the review process, we do think that you could reverse that presumption, which is a matter of executive order, not a matter of legislation, and be relatively simple to do and would clarify and I think clear up this whole thing. Question, just to expand briefly on the question of movement of personnel that you all both alluded to, I think, earlier. To what extent are there impediments that relate to the portability of credentials, skills certifications, as opposed to, in other words, if there were no visa requirements, no visa restrictions of moving people around, is there an issue moving Americans to Canada, Canadians to the United States, or anybody to Mexico or Mexicans to anywhere else based on the kind of credential they bring with them?
I mean, delving into an area that I know enough about to be dangerous.
That's where we all live.
It's more than me. Thanks. Over to you.
So, you know, there are mechanisms to obtain visa and move relatively free flow of, quote, professional engineering, accounting type, and that, at least in our company's experience, is relatively straightforward. The problem that we run into, and I think Rob was alluding to, is when you get in, I hate the term because the folks that we use are by no stretch of the definition unskilled, but what the rules view as unskilled labor, and meaning that, you know, people without a professional designation that they can categorize. So the folks that are running our rigs, supervising our sites, there is a huge challenge in moving those people across the border, and certainly doing that efficiently. When we're, especially in our business, we're short cycle work, short cycle capital. We're looking for flexibility to move rigs around our plays, and, you know, influenced by things like weather and timing and road bans and all that kind of stuff that has real on the ground implications. We want to be able to move entire crews from area to area, and that really is not practically possible right now.
Yeah.
Does that get to your question?
John, I think we're going to wrap it up. So.
Yes. No, I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking my panelists here for a fantastic night.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're running a little bit behind schedule, so we're going to take a much shorter break than we had planned, so about 5 minutes, and then we're going to reconvene here for the panel on regulation. So we can call it what we like, a biological break, a comfort break, or just a natter break, but be back here in 5 minutes, please. Thank you.